So with that, I'd ask people to pop their questions into the Q&A, and we will answer them after we've heard from our final two speakers and whose work has been referenced. Our first speaker in this session is Crystal Lee, and Crystal is a PhD candidate at MIT, and she's also a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. She studies the political and social implications of data visualization, and her work has also shown mapping, showing how data is actually an embodied practice, and it encodes arguments about gender, ability, modernity, which are translated into user interfaces. Following Crystal, we're going to hear from Sara Hendren, and Sara Hendren is a humanist in tech. She's an artist, a design researcher, a writer, and a professor at Olin College of Engineering outside Boston. And her book, What a Body Can Do, How We Meet the Built World, explores the unexpected places where disability is at the heart of everyday design. And this uncovers the lessons available really in the way our bodies connect with the material world. And that can be household objects, architecture, urban planning, and more. Sara's work has been widely exhibited in museum exhibitions and is in the permanent collection at MoMA, the Cooper Hewitt. And you'll find her writing and design work on NPR, Fast Company, the New York Times. She's a former fellow of the New America think tank and the Carey Institute for Global Goods. And she joins us from Boston. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Crystal, who I believe is going to share her screen.
Great. So hi. In my talk today, I'm going to share some of the core ideas about my mission to design meaningful multisensory experiences where data visualization experts and cartographers alike can design experiences that take disability more broadly into account. So I'll say up front that I don't have the answers yet about how to mobilize this into practice in really concrete ways, but hopefully this will be the result of my PhD. But embarking on this has really helped me critically examine efforts to do this both in past and in present, which give me a framework to really think about designing and evaluating these kinds of technologies. So by way of introduction, I'm a researcher in science and technology studies who uses insights from disability studies to make and interrogate data visualizations. But before I get into that more concretely, I want to frame my talk with a concept from human-computer interaction theory, beyond being there. And I'm going to illustrate it by talking about a technology we're all familiar with, Zoom. So before you tune out completely, I'll say that I'm trying to use it as an example about the inherent tensions at the juncture of design and disability. And I want to use this example to really think about resolving them. So I think it's pretty safe to say that we've all heard some version of these arguments as it relates to access. So first, that using Zoom has given people the opportunity to attend to professional opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be possible, like me doing this presentation. At the same time, and maybe more importantly, the outsized reliance on Zoom has also just thrown existing social inequalities into sharper relief and sometimes even exacerbated them. So I'm thinking about like digital infrastructure and economic conditions. And throughout all of this, we all feel this overwhelming collective sense of fatigue. And the common refrain is often, I can't wait for the after times where we don't have to Zoom anymore. And to be clear, I relate to this very deeply. But others have suggested, and often more eloquently than me, that we're partly tired by screen time, but it's really capitalism, the lack of a meaningful social safety net, the exploitation of vulnerable workers, that's the root of the fatigue. In other words, it's a structural problem. But let's also attend to this as a design problem. So how can we think about designing a future that allows us to capitalize on the strides in access while acknowledging and mitigating the harms of using this technology? So Zoom, as we've seen, is not a panacea and has a range of accessibility problems. And there's a myriad of security, privacy, and moderation issues that abound on this platform. And just yesterday, a virtual reading with the legendary cyborg Jillian Visa was Zoom bombed. And the designer Liz Jackson writes on Twitter, and this is a screenshot of her tweet, about the remnants of a Zoom bombing of a disability event. And she attaches an image, which is just a black square that says chat disabled. But let's come back to beyond being there. If the point is to imitate face-to-face interaction, then this kind of design is just set up for failure. And if people use these technologies like 3D holograms or like an increased, better version of Zoom, but they still prioritize face-to-face interactions to those who are physically proximate to them, then there's always going to be this gap. So in the words of Jim Holland and Stornetta, who wrote this paper on Beyond Being There, what we're getting at is this. Telecommunications research seems to work under the implicit assumption that there's a natural and perfect state, quote, being there, and that our state is in some sense broken when we're not physically proximate. So this idea of being there and having a natural and perfect state, this is the ableism of, say, academic participation policies as a physical presence as opposed to academic engagement as a marker for participation. And really circumventing this kind of thinking requires us to invent and think about new mediums where we focus on the kinds of communications we would have even if face-to-face interaction were possible. And the examples that they give in this paper, this being the 90s, looks very similar to the world that we have today, like email, asynchronous social media services, and community chat boards. But so this is not to say that all forms of imitation or emulation are bad or that we shouldn't do them. This is more to emphasize that the barometer for what makes them successful shouldn't be replicating the real thing, a concept that often assumes able-bodiedness or a status quo that more often than not is already violent, but about radically reimagining a new way to think, be, and interact. In other words, instead of romanticizing the before times or previous technologies, let's work together to fundamentally reimagine not just the technologies, but the social ecologies in which they're embedded. So I'm reminded here of some wisdom from a friend of mine about how technology and design can simultaneously over and under promise. So simplistically, designing inclusive technology that over promises can be a way of re-entrenching techno-ableism. So what is techno-ableism? Techno-ableism, in the words of Ashley Hsu at Virginia Tech, describes a rhetoric of disability that at once talks about empowering disabled people through technologies, while at the same time reinforcing ableist tropes about what body minds are good to have and what counts as worthy. And so famous examples of this include cochlear implants or exoskeletons, like wheelchairs that can climb stairs instead of using ramps. So if we're talking about over-optimistic and frankly dangerous forms of this kind of design, we're really usually talking about inventions that try to eradicate disability or force disabled bodies into ableist norms. And there's nothing inclusive or anti-ableist about designing something that simply makes oppression more efficient or actively hides it. At the same time, this design paradigm is under-ambitious insofar as it tries to optimize the status quo, and there's no deeper engagement on changing the social world in which the technologies live. And so the intense focus in the case of Zoom on replicating the feeling of being there undercuts the substantial contributions that designers can make and limits the affordances of these new technologies. And paired with the techno-ableism of trying to optimize the status quo, this is a design paradigm that we shouldn't aspire to reproduce because it would reproduce the same kind of violence. So to conclude this first part, I want to argue that reflecting on these dynamics can be a source of ethical practice. And we don't want to idealize an anterior or a present condition, but how do we embrace a new paradigm of interaction entirely? And how do we critically think about these functions? So Amy Hemry and Kelly Frisch have one answer: embracing crypt technoscience. And echoing the other panelists today, Hemry and Frisch argue that while technology can be deployed for unwanted cures or enhancements, it can also be reclaimed, hacked, and tinkered with to create a more accessible world. And by centering crypt theory and politics, we hold space for what Alison Kafer calls ambivalent relationships to technology. So from here, I want to give a few examples of how this manifests with data visualization and map making, and I'll describe this in 3 major themes. So first, the woes of one-to-one translation, which I kind of gestured at before. 2, the need to be transparent, minimal, and straightforward. And finally, to kind of really engage with competing accommodations. So first, I'm going to show a failed attempt on my part to create a system of easily generating 3D visualizations for people who might be blind or have low vision. So my collaborators and I were interested to see if we could generate these on the fly. Since the educators at the Perkins School for the Blind with whom we had collaborated were making these visualizations on a kind of artisanal basis as they needed them. And it was a huge amount of work every time in order to produce this kind of thing. And so as an example, we drew on the tactual map of MIT. And here I'm showing an unrolled vinyl map on a table with raised etchings. And some of it says the tactual map of MIT alongside a etching of the campus. So this is a picture of the textured legend. Water, sidewalks, fences, roads, etc. Are all rendered as different kinds of dots, lines, and geometric symbols. And often the problem with these maps is that they assume that sighted and tactile learners absorb information the same way. So Lucia Hasty says, sighted learners learn new information in what's called whole to part. They see the whole part simultaneously and are able to tell where that fits in relation to other objects around it. So size, distance, that kind of thing. Whereas tactile learners learn in exactly the opposite direction. They learn part to whole. They get information from what they're looking at, like a tactile graphic, with whatever they're seeing at the moment. And what you touch is what you see. And if they have to put all of those little pieces of information together in a sequence in order to come up with a whole picture. So let's come to the second point about being transparent, minimal, and straightforward. So drawing on best practices of historical Braille transcription and tactile graphics, and here I'm showing a picture from a tactile graphic instruction guide with all of these different tools like tweezers and different kinds of scalpels. Many of these tools used in making tactile visualizations is very much not the kind of flashy data storytelling, data journalism work, but this kind of bespoke artisanal work. So to this end, a great deal of my research is thinking not just about computing and interactivity, but about the limitations and potentials of fabrication. So how can we work both in preserving and extending the best practices about embossing and Braille specifications, particularly with minimal tools? And here I'm showing a picture of like a hand actually making embossings within the same guide. And then on the other side of the page, I'm showing like what the embossings actually look like dotted lines and straight lines and other symbols like triangles and circles. So how can we reduce visual and tactile clutter and use textures and shapes judiciously? And my collaborator, Alan, is thinking a lot about the affordances of things like natural language processing as a way to create clear, concise text summaries. And there have been other projects like alt text as poetry. This is a picture of a book that says alt text as poetry, the grassy background, that teaches people how to implement alt text as in practice. So finally, to the third point, there are also competing accommodations. As Elizabeth has really shown, universal design in a lot of ways is impossible and sometimes undesirable. And if we think about these different ways of making visualizations more accessible, they're equally inaccessible for other people. So data sonification, for example, can be inaccessible for deaf people, and haptic interfaces are largely inaccessible during plague season and can be inaccessible for people with touch sensitivities, or in cases where Braille is present, for people who don't read Braille. And olfactory approaches are impossible for those with fragrance sensitivity. And frankly, I have not found them to encode information in a way that is really efficient. So where does this leave us? I want to show some examples, though, of data sonification that I find really compelling, which can improve the experiences of a visualization and not just as an adjunct. particularly for individuals with ADHD, to emphasize audibly what they see visually. So for example, the data-driven DJ Brian Fu, a sound artist, has created semi-orchestral pieces that sonify things like Beijing air quality data or income inequality, where each piece manipulates noise in order to highlight peaks and valleys. And here I am showing like snapshots from his videos on smog music and sonification of income equality, where you basically see like different dots that show how dangerous the air quality is in Beijing. And like these other one shows a moving train line that's moving through Brooklyn. And you can see a kind of similar dynamic with Carney Clear's sonification of the New York Times COVID death chart, where he punctuates time and adds noise as the deaths pile up. And so I'm going to try to show that sound right now. So what you've heard there is really like the number of deaths piling up with like an increasing tempo, and then it's punctuated throughout time. And so where does this lead us? So I will acknowledge that a great deal of what I said is ultimately unsatisfying, and that what I've provided is mostly a template for speculative futures that all hinge upon the phrase, "it depends." But what I hope you can take away from this talk is a framework and a call to action to think beyond being there, and to join me in reimagining both technologies we design and the social worlds that we inhabit together.
Thank you, Crystal. We're going to turn it over to Sara, and then we'll take Q&A. Hello, Sara. Thank you.
Hello. Great. Well, so it's so good to be here with all of you and with these amazing thinkers who I respect so much. And I bring you greetings from Boston. I think Crystal is around here too. It's about 8 degrees or something. So hope you Californians are enjoying a non-winter, but I bring you warm greetings and glad to join you in this really interesting quest to think really well together about both what design can do and access that can be created, the creativity and the urgency that's present both. I will share my screen now and sort of talk through some ideas, but let me just say that I'll just to underscore all 3 thinkers who've just spoken now. I'll just sort of zoom out for us to try to launch, what's going to happen tomorrow, and especially folks who are here who are thinking about practice and are thinking about next moves that they need to make. I spent all today teaching participatory design practice, and so I know that those are real urgent questions on people's minds, so I'll tune my remarks in that direction. So let me just share my screen. Are you seeing this first slide?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So, right, this is our kind of shared topic, design and disability, ? And lots of times, just again, to zoom way out from and to reframe what it is we're talking about at a high level. Most of the time, people associate those 2 words when they come together with one of 2 things. One is an image of a very high-tech prosthetic arm, and that's what you're looking at here, a man who's got a flesh arm on the right and a machinic arm on the left, sort of myoelectrics or the best that money can buy. And the strong persuasive story that's usually behind technologies like this. So coming out of engineering laboratories, quite expensive, high on biomimicry, and also technological sophistication. And this persuasive story also hinges on not just the restoration idea of function, but also the restoration of identity. So this left hand has a wedding ring on it, and the kind of promise that seems to deliver. That's one. And the other is, of course, as you've heard already today, this idea of universal design. And here I'm just showing you 3 of the canonical examples, 2 that repeat Elizabeth's, the Cuisinart food processor and the OXO Good Grips kitchen tools, and also in the center, the Aeron chair, which is now kind of high status chair at offices in like Silicon Valley and places. And that is also has its roots in aging and a kind of super ergonomic design, all kinds of flexibility and so on. So people tend to think, okay, design and disability, high-end innovation on the one hand, or this universal design. And we've already heard today about some of the limitations of those things. But so what is it if it's not just these 2 things? And I would suggest that they are the tip of the iceberg that is a really fertile ground and full of lots of questions, again, as you've heard today. So what are we talking about with design and disability? Let me just indicate that lots of people are kind of energetically answering and exploring this issue. And I'm showing you the book covers of just a few of the books that have come out in the last 5 years or so, including Bess Williamson's Accessible America, our own Elizabeth Guffey's Designing Disability, Amy Hamrai, who's been quoted already today, their book, Building Access, this co-edited Testing Hearing, Mara Mills, Alexandra Hui, and Victoria Tozik, and then Jaipreet Birdi's Hearing Happiness, again, some of many. I also have a book out on this topic too, What Can a Body Do? How we meet the built world. Well, what are we talking about then? If we're not talking about those other things only, at the highest level, we are talking about the human experience of getting help. And that is help that we give and help that we receive, no matter what body we're in. And if that's the experience we're talking about, then design is a civic practice and disability is a civic matter. And I think this is so important that we keep this kind of big frame and big house of what it means to get help, designed, human, and otherwise. And not only that, but that there is a desirable future that has assistance in it. And that our efforts are not actually to design the help out of the world and out of our lives, but in fact, to keep that robust, thriving future, that strong dream of a shared, plural, democratic future with assistance robustly in it, visible, unifying assistance. Okay, so how else might we talk about this then to get there? Rosemary Garland Thompson has this wonderful, wonderfully useful idea of what the condition of disability is. She says a body in the world that is misfitting. And so misfit seemed like a, commonplace term, even kind of slang-ish, but she says, misfitting is being a square peg in a round hole world. Well, okay, it also sounds kind of common sense, say I'm being a misfit. But if you say I'm a square peg in a round hole world, what that means is that the misfit actually runs both ways. It's actually not at all clear where the onus of the, quote, problem or challenge lies, that the misfit is running from a body trying to meet the world, but also the rigidity of the world trying to meet a body. So it's important, I think, that we land on these commonplace terms that are actually packed with ideas, in part to just invest our energy again in thinking about what we're really talking about at that misfit level. That changes all the questions for designers. It's not just about creating access in a let's expand the canopy and not forget to include. No, let's look at all the places where misfitting has this really interesting set of conundrums about it. And it's actually not clear for the designer or the engineer, where is the site in which we might intervene? So just to kind of demonstrate this at the level of prosthetic limbs, this kind of very familiar space. I'll get to the digital later, but I'm showing you a couple of images that appear in my book in this chapter on prosthetic limbs. And one on the left is a middle-aged white man using one of these myoelectric arms, one of these very expensive arms that he is the latest in his generation of arms that have been built for him since he was age 14 and became an amputee. And so he finds this tool quite transformative. Again, it's in a family of arms that he's used. And so again, this is a story that's familiar to us, but I've got it contrasted then with an image on the right of a 30-something white man, blonde with a ponytail, who's standing at the diaper changing table with his newborn baby, and Chris is his name. He has a flesh arm on the left, but on the right, his residual limb tapers off just below the shoulder. And Chris is somebody who actually refused and had no use for the half a dozen very nice prosthetic limbs that were built for him over the course of his life. He just is so adaptive and plastic in his body. He was born this way. So it just turned out never to be the case that one of those, the high-tech arms were what was called for. And instead he fashioned what you're looking at here, which is this kind of soft felted cords, little holster for suspending the little ankles of his baby so that he can change his diaper one-handed. And so this is not just a kind of high-tech or low-tech kind of, moral hierarchy of what's better or best. None of those kind of gradations seems to me are that interesting. It's just that what you find is that inventiveness and adaptation is truly everywhere. So it's in laboratories, it's also in people's living rooms. And as designers, we want to be keeping that ethnographic window aperture really quite wide of what would count as technology, who's doing it, who's at the source, what would count as innovation, and so on. And it just gets more interesting from here. So I'm showing you a group of 4 images that all have kind of to do with the expanded, vast world of the way we think about prosthetics. And one on the bottom right may be familiar to you. That's World War II veterans, a black and white image of the line of men who've come home from the field in World War II, missing partial limbs. And those folks are who gave us the big field of rehabilitation engineering, lots of research dollars and kind of national priorities around creating limbs to restore that function. And there's this incredible, kind of civic patriotic history that's attached to those prosthetics, really interesting history. So it ties us to kind of a national story that's happening there. Meanwhile, on the upper left, if you want to, talk about innovation and impact, the Jaipur Foot organization in India, as exemplified here, there's a clinician here in India who's working with a young boy on fashioning a lower limb leg prosthesis out of more low-tech materials, quite robust plastics and so on, but built and distributed for free all over India to the tune of $1.5 million now, and all over South Asia. What an incredible, kind of networked labor practice, making possible replacement parts for people who need them. But there's also the refusal of prosthetics entirely. So in the lower left, I have an image of Audre Lorde, one of our great American poets and essayists who wrote about gender and race, and also wrote a book called The Cancer Journals about surviving breast cancer, including a mastectomy on one side. And Lorde tells the story of going to the doctor's office in kind of her post-op exam mode, and she doesn't wear the prosthetic breast that they gave her to wear after the surgery. And in fact, she wakes up happy in an asymmetrical body and puts on one earring and thinks, look at me, I've come through this terrifying illness. And the nurse says to her at the doctor's office, why aren't you wearing the prosthesis that we gave you? And she says, yeah, I'm good. I'm happy without it. And the nurse says, well, we certainly wish you would wear it, because it's kind of bad morale for the office if you don't. So that is a biopolitical moment where the prosthesis arrives to actually make meaning for other people about our bodies, right? Or vice versa, that we are actually imputing meaning, not just to our own bodies and identities, but we're thinking about it mediated by technology on the bodies of others. And finally, this woman, Cindy, who became a quadruple amputee at age 60 and qualified for one of those very high-tech limbs, went through all the training and everything. And it is sitting now literally gathering dust in the closet while she has fashioned a whole series and suite of tools for doing what she actually wants to get done. So you're seeing here, she's looking at the camera and you can see that she's had most of the digits on both hands removed. And so she can grasp an eyeliner to put on makeup, but only with this rubber tubing, which is this kind of lifesaver low-tech technology. And I'll just add to that my favorite tool of Cindy's, which is this pen cap. So I'm showing you that it's made out of like a silicone, just scraps of silicone. That's a fitted cap that goes over her residual limb on the right side, over her hand. And it's fitted then with a ballpoint pen lodged at just such an angle that she can write again in her handwriting. This is a tool made for like $10. Skilled labor at the prosthetist for sure, but not costly, highly bespoke, and eminently meaningful, just transformative, in use every single day. And how astonishing that is then to find ourselves in an economy of built stuff that we opt into, that we opt out of, that we purchase and sort of qualify for under insurance that comes from laboratories, that was built on a whole history of military combat, and also in the tiniest intimate domestic settings of our lives, and that arrive in all kinds of materials and shaped in all kinds of ways. I hope that this is an activation of our collective wonder at what is happening in this ecosystem of the way that bodies meet the world. Sarah's kind of operative theory of change is that you actually have to activate that wonder in order to actually ask better questions and build better stuff. So when I would just exhort folks who are doing the hard work of design now to be thinking not just in terms of closures, not just in terms of access barriers, but also openings. So to be thinking in terms of what is difficult and a hindrance, and also the kinds of things, the deep, deep inventiveness and adaptation that's happening for people all the time. And of course, all good designers know you need a kind of process of divergence before you get to convergence. And you need to think across scales in order to do that. So I'll just say, I'll give you a couple more examples to think about. Even though we're talking about archives, I want to just pay attention to a couple of other scales for working. So at the scale of products, I would just exhort young designers to look at Zubits. I mean, what's happening here is there's a pair of sneakers and a little magnetic closure that will turn any lace-up sneaker into a magnetic closed shoe, just like that. Will adapt. And so we can talk all day about this, but I won't. I'll just say briefly that the principle here is taking a really close look at something that's been taken for granted, and that is the kind of normativity of the lace-up sneaker. So what is the kind of factor for young designers? What is the factor that everybody assumes and takes for granted is necessary? Okay, let's remove that. What would happen? And this is one of those elegant tools at product scale. You might also look at DefSpace, which is at Gallaudet University. And here I'm just showing you the lobby of a DefSpace dorm, which has got features of wood and concrete and solid colors to make ASL actually possible. So this is an envelope of a building that's built around deaf ways of being. It has no interest in actually solving for the condition of not hearing. In fact, it is built to alter the properties of sound and sight in a way that honors the experience of deafness. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. But also down the street from Gallaudet is the Signing Starbucks, and I wanted people to see this at the scale of service design. So we're just looking at 2 women staff members at a Starbucks, at the Signing Starbucks in Washington, D.C., just down the road from Gallaudet. And the tools that a hearing person like myself going to going to the Signing Starbucks are really quite simple, and they change everything. So this is an image of a wipe away LCD tablet on the left, and I use that to write my name down in my order. And then a simple TV monitor on the right that's at the end of the coffee bar that comes up when your order is ready. Think about that. It changes all the dynamics in the room. The power dynamics are utterly altered by some very simple technology, but a really profound idea. And that is that the entire exchange can change such that the public sphere becomes richer and more plural in what its normativity is, and like in the most kind of commercial mainstream coffee venue. I mean, I just think this is extraordinary. People imagine that creating access is always going to be technologically difficult, and yet here it's quite simple and elegant. And lastly, just this example from Singapore City, the Green Man Plus program. So what you're looking at is a man holding a little Metro card that's outfitted with a microchip that hovers over the call box for a pedestrian signal. And if you're an older adult in Singapore or a disabled person, and your sensor then can be outfitted on this Metro card, when you hover over that call box, the walking time across the street will expand by up to 12 or 13 seconds. So it is making a literal longer affordance of passage just for you as you cross the street, and then it reverts to its normative time. So it had been 24 seconds, it's 32 for you, for example, and then back to 24. What a incredibly beautiful way of thinking about a city that breathes, in and out as needed. This is like at 500 intersections in Singapore City. So all of these are just meant to sort of say there's creativity and urgency at every scale. You could be thinking about these for digital experiences, you should, in fact, find analogies and patterns everywhere. Disabled people are doing some of the most interesting work in design. You should think in terms of closures and openings. Okay, the last little bit in terms of digital examples, I'm just showing you lines of code, standard lines of code, which don't make sense to me, but do to engineers. Well, Scratch, and I'm showing you now an image of Scratch, is a visualization of code. So Scratch is just like interlocking blocks. You're seeing these multicolored blocks of if-then statements, but they're turned into interlocking blocks to change the normative state. So where this might be abstract. So if you're thinking about archives and information, think about Scratch as a kind of inversion of the normative interface kind of just approach, just the way that the information is organized. Scratch is a really beautiful way of thinking about changing what had been like just lines and lines of text into blocks that you can piece together literally. I took a close look at Descript, which is this multi-use platform for editing podcasts or short films. And I'm just showing you the image here that's got like a bit of text that is showing you all kinds of commands for cutting and pasting, a kind of timeline along the bottom, a kind of for building sound beds and so on. Usually this stuff is housed in deep programs of film or video, but Descript is this multi-sensory way of trying to interact with media that you want to create when you're a non-expert. Really interesting, worth your time, I think, to look at the analogies and the patterns. What's the normative interaction and then what's happening here. And finally, WeVideo, which is like not at all, is simpler than Premiere, simpler than Avid, some of the standard film editing. WeVideo is drag and drop, highly accessible. All my kids use it, and I think something's going right there where you're taking the standard, what is usually a deep nested, labyrinth of information and possibilities, and making it incredibly intuitive, and again, the drag and drop logic and highly visual and so on. So all of this, again, just to say that the desirability actually of assistance is what we're after here, that assistance is part of a salutary life and future that has help in it. So thanks, everybody.
Wow, thank you. That was amazing. I've got so many questions I'd like to ask. I know we have one from Forrest. If other people would like to add in their questions, I wanted to ask our panelists to, turn their cameras back on. I almost said unmute. And I guess I have a question for the panel about something that I think is running through this. And it came out in It Depends. It came out, I think, when I heard about transforming affordances. It comes out when we say that we normalize to a model, whether it's in data or the built world, where no normal exists. And that there needs to be an understanding that we live and work in a tension. There's not an answer. And I think for many of us in design, that kind of turns our paradigm on its head, right? That there's going to be the role of being a facilitator, not necessarily an owner of a solution. In fact, the idea of a solution doesn't quite exist. So I really appreciated the statement that design is a civic matter and that assistance is a form of reciprocity. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, as a designer, how does one find a starting point? And how does one discern a process that can make this intersectional multiplicity, multi-channel inputs possible? I wondered if you had an example, of further examples of how you get started in this type of work. I think I'll ask Elizabeth. I see you nodding.
I was nodding partly because I know that Sara is just teaching this today. So I was looking to Sara thinking that she probably has a lot to say about it. But I will add that I think that you're absolutely right. I think that one of the challenges in this, talking about disability and design, is that as a bunch of academics talk about disability, it can be quite exciting to think about the ways that disability challenge questions of normalcy. But when you actually try to translate that into practice, it becomes really difficult to boil all this down to any kind of practicable sorts of steps to take, at least so it seems on the surface. I will say that that some of the strengths and dangers that we're always talking about within academia about design is not just that there's a kind of sameness that comes to what's produced from mass production, but there's also a kind of sameness that we assume about users at the end. So we, of course, have this growing conversation about designing for not just designing for the designer, but designing for user experiences. That, of course, is one of the big trends that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years. But at the same time, I don't think that we've figured out ways to have a full enough resolution about which humans actually are counting as our users. And that's the thing that I think you're getting at, is the trying to get those practices in place. And so what the kind of experiential design that I'm talking about, the practices with co-design and human experience design really can be really transformative, but there are things that really have to be brought into the design process early. I'll turn over to Sara because, like I say, she's just been teaching this literally a few hours ago, and I'm sure other panelists as well will have more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Maggie, I think it's a blend of what is good practice in general, which is just to say, right, a combination of ethnographic practices and then the widest possible ideation. And this is what I mean about the creativity and inventiveness part. Like, I think this field gets a little bit overladen with earnestness and also medical pathos. And I think look for, again, patterns and analogies everywhere. That's a good ideation process. Look across scales and so on. And assume always that in your ethnographic interviews, you are not, of course, just looking for problems. You are looking for assets and challenges, closures and openings. It's that kind of framing, seems to me, that drives good practice in the way that it does in general. And stop making scale into your only, impact metric for impact. And no bespoke universe is arriving for any of us, it seems to me. So just because we can intellectually point to ways that certain kinds of technologies are more or less accessible to other kinds of people. I think we need to ask ourselves all the time, what can a small, elegant gesture do targeted towards a particular population? If it is at cross purposes on some level, we're not going to get rid of ramps just because they are a bit of a problem for blind pedestrians. We are going to try to live into that, right? We are adapting all the time, right? So we're not going to shut down our process because there is some cross purpose that we can identify. We are going to keep seeking to iterate through our best practices and do what we can. Mm-hmm. So small moves, seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in response to this question, my thought is often, first and foremost, to ask why something hasn't been done in the first place, or to look at why things are the way they are. I think we oftentimes when looking ahead, we go, this is the way the things should be, and how do I get started? And I think first and foremost, you have to really understand the inherent biases that exist and reasons and logistics that play in the way a current thing is. I often tell people when discussing accessibility and discussing doing things right the first time, I often say that it's going to cost a minimum of 3 times to repair something, 3 times the original cost. So, I use a debt example. If you're $30,000 in debt, you're going to need $30,000 to come out of debt, which then puts you at 0, but that doesn't correct the healthcare costs you didn't have during the time you were in debt, the health crisis you didn't address, the home repairs you opted out of. So then you'll need another 30,000 potentially to repair all the things that were left behind, and then an additional 30,000 hypothetically to get you up and started and in position, right? So a minimum kind of 3 times to repair something. So do it right the first time is the point. But it also brings up the idea that there's a very real cost to correcting things and designing things. And so I think scale definitely should not be your only measure or a scale of impact. But I also think it's as a project manager, and I'm a heavy project manager, it's very heavily saying, 1, of course, what's the problem at hand? And 2, really what's the scale of the problem? On the surface level, something may seem to be an easy fix until you really look into it and realize that it's way more systemic than initially thought through. So I think that there is no one answer on how to get started. It's about understanding your problem, understanding the problem you're designing for, understanding the scale of the issue you're trying to fix or address, or even just make more efficient.
Mm-hmm. Crystal, do you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wanted to amplify what Sarah was talking about in terms of like deep ethnographic process and practice. I mean, I think like that speaks to what Jasmine was talking about in terms of like really interrogating why something hasn't already been done in the first place. And I think really practicing like humility and considerateness in this kind of ethnographic practice is really important to me, because I think ethnography is a way of really thinking about how to incorporate like the socio-technical at the beginning rather than at the end. And I think being attentive to those details is really important. And I mean, to Sarah's point earlier about finding like both assets and challenges and closures and openings, I mean, I think for myself, like, I think it's been really exciting to kind of tune into like the emotional valences of how people feel about technologies. So like finding joy, I think, is a really good way of like ideating as widely as possible, but also like tapping into anger and understanding where that comes from is a way of understanding how challenges manifest. So I hope that can be at least a starting point for like thinking about what is ethnographically possible.
Right on. And can I just say one other thing, Maggie? And it just goes to something that Crystal actually said, which is that like, you know, I think designers also need to be very, very clear about things that are not designable, right? That there is a hard stop after which we're talking about politics. We are talking about economics, policy, right? Legal structures. In other words, and Josh was kind of asking about this. I mean, I think we cannot responsibilize young designers with accounting for every structural inequity and trying to house it in a little thing. Like, it is precisely undesignable, seems to me. So if we're going to be whole people and we're going to be civic agents, we're going to be partly doing that in design and partly what we do with our time and partly about how we lobby and advocate, right? It is one tool among many, but it's a setup, it seems to me, to the death of good practice if we don't be really clear about what is not designed, capital N, capital D, you know, like it ain't there, like, so.
So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit. Josh asked a question for those of you who can see it in the Q&A. Josh asks, first of all, he commends everyone on wonderful presentations. He asks if you can share a little bit more about how to guide young non-disabled design students towards this intersectional understanding of ableism through other identities, whether it's race, gender, citizenship status. And how can those young designers mobilize this sensibility to relate not just to disabled co-designers, but to designer exclusion, alienation, and or marginalization? I think that falls in Jasmine's work.
Yes. I think that one thing that we overlook, and I talk about this a lot in DI language, is we oftentimes make things passive that aren't passive. So we'll say, you know, these voices just magically aren't here. And I'm like, no, they are actively excluded. We normalize their exclusion every day. There are little things that we do every day that communicate to others that it is normal, acceptable, and expected to overlook certain people and certain issues. Whether it be for pragmatic reasons, whether it be for whatever other thing. And the first thing that we have to do is to actively push back against that. So the way that we've done this in the makerspace at Temple University is the first thing I did was just complete an audit of our makerspace and of our space in general. I did that very openly with all of our students present and went through and said, you know, these counters are way too high. And somebody's not going to be able to climb into this chair. We're going to have problems, period. You know, these are touch screens. What happens what are we going to do if someone comes in and can't use a touch screen for whatever reason? What happens if someone's blind? These don't read out. And I brought up a bunch of problems and I had everybody sit together and we all brainstormed together. We all said, what are we going to do if this happens? How are we going to record the solutions that we were coming up with for these problems? So for the counter example, they're like, we'll rearrange these lower tables, move things over. We understand it's not ideal, but we didn't have a say in the architecture of the building. So we're going to have to but it's understood altogether. And really what that did is say, you know what, culturally, it deconstructed the idea that, you know, somebody should come in and kind of go deer in the headlights. We did this when we did user testing for VR. Somebody who was deaf came in, and that was one of the first things they said. They're like, I can't tell you how many times I go into spaces, and just being deaf, the person freezes up and I can't even get help because they don't know what to do because I'm deaf. And so the first thing that we wanted to break down was, I told students that, and I was like, we need to make it so that it is not acceptable, considered normal to passively communicate to people that they're not welcome here, or that they can't be helped, or that they can't use our materials. And so I think that it's an act of, it's not just telling people verbally, it's showing them how that's done. It's making them participate in it's inviting them and also guiding them through that process. And it's also teaching them to actively question. So it's not just teaching them what to do, but what questions they should be asking when they engage in things. So when that process taught students to be like, why don't we have deaf students here? Why don't we have deaf students on campus? Philadelphia has a huge deaf population. Why aren't they here?
I think that backs it a little bit into Forrest's question, which is, just to kind of summarize what I read into, and I'll read his question in a moment, is how can a neurodiverse person be in the room if a neurodiverse person can't use the tools to have the accreditation to be in the room? So Forrest writes in his question, as a neurodiverse graduate student in the information sciences, I'm constantly encountering barriers in the presentation of content and the lack of visual aids, in addition to the loss of tactile practical engagement due to COVID. Disability resources is unequipped to support my situation, so I'm left to self-advocate to mixed responses. And it's inspiring a lot of thought about how we can institutionalize accessible practices. How can we push cultural change in academia in order to produce more representative, diverse information professionals when there are so many forces preventing the success of those same people? And I left Forrest's question to the end because I think it really crystallizes archives, academia, making, advocacy, and the importance of practice. So I wanted to share that with the group and maybe hear from you in response to Forrest.
Well, I want to pick up on what Jasmine was saying and amplify what Forrest was also mentioning. I think an important thing, and to Josh's point, which is kind of the flip side of what Forrest is mentioning, I think that what needs to be emphasized and people across the board need to realize is just how contingent disability really is. Something that we would consider a mild impairment today, which is like vision problems. So I actually use two assistive devices. One is a walking assistive device, which is a pretty noticeable thing most of the time, but you don't see it at all because we're in Zoom in this strange ambient atmosphere right now. On the other hand, I also, like a lot of aging people, have had worse and worse vision. So I also use these, which are also an assistive device. But our society has so normalized eyeglasses at this point. I don't even think that people think of this as an assistive device. I think it's really important. It's no longer an impairment. That is my vision problem because I've got this assistive device. Nobody really thinks about them as being special or different. I think what's important for people to recognize is that they often share in forms of disability, that this is really a kind of slippery thing to define. But the more you can bring that home to people and for them to be able to work their way through these ideas, the better. In teaching context, to go back to Josh and what Jasmine is talking about, I often start off class asking students to bring in their own disability object and stuff that people bring in, things that say disability to them, because almost everybody owns something that somehow is assistive in some sort of way. You know, some students bring in pill bottles, other people bring in things like glasses. To be able to get that across, and that is on all levels of academic structures, so not just students, but also to the people who are above you, is really important. And the more you can do that, the more sort of positive feedback you get. And believe me, I've done a lot of advocating for myself over the years, and you have to go about it the right way. I agree that it's easy. It's actually quite easy to make a lot of enemies through that. So there has to be right and wrong ways, and it's something that has to be felt out kind of carefully. I'll turn to the other panelists over to here because it's a great question.
Just, I guess, to further get into Forrest's question, I see that they've said that they use they, them pronouns. I will say that the cultural change was my primary focus when I did this. So my background's in African American studies primarily, disability studies. I have a certificate. I did pursue coursework and do things in that, but I've advocated for being Black a very long time. And when I came across that intersection of disability, which disability and Blackness intersect very heavily, for me, I was really focused on, as I said, really addressing the passive ways. It's not just that, then it's like I said, it's the ways we communicate. So I think about professors who penalize students who say, I've lost a grandparent, and, or who feel comfortable. Why do they feel comfortable with penalizing a student who needs an accommodation? Well, we get into this and say, well, there's a lot of ways, right? So one, if they go to their tenure file and say, well, I changed my whole testing style to be more accommodating, they could be penalized on their end. And this goes higher up and higher up and higher up, right? And when it comes down to it, it goes to, I say money, time, resources, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, the main way you communicate value is by allocating those things to populations, is by saying, we're going to dedicate time to figuring out how to fix this problem. We're going to dedicate, and when it comes to accountability, demanding that those things be allocated to these spaces. And so I've thought about this frequently when it comes to being remote now. I not only suffer from severe migraines, so staring at a screen all day has not been great for me. ADHD/dyslexia. So staring at emails all day, I eventually get tired and I've just become illiterate. I'm an illiterate puddle at the end of the day. But everything's via email, right? And there's nothing that can be, like I can talk to my supervisor, but those accommodations aren't necessarily there. I have to start thinking about, and this is why I bring up the 3 thing and logistics so much. I have to start saying, we need to dedicate this much time and money. And unfortunately, when you advocate for yourself, that shouldn't have to fall on you by yourself. But I oftentimes just say, I want these specific things. It's going to cost this much. Here's a project plan, and this is what we need to do. And it has to be made a priority. And as Elizabeth said, it can make you a lot of enemies. Nobody would ever, anybody who works with me will tell you that's not going to determine me. But unfortunately, cultural change isn't just a matter of sentiment, which I do a lot of DEI work. That's something like a common pitfall people fall into. It is a matter of demanding and being very specific about the time, money, resources, whatever manpower, whatever it is that you need to use, and being very vocal and specific about demanding that from the people you have to demand that from. And so it unfortunately leaves people out to dry sometimes in the meantime, because that advocacy takes time. It doesn't change overnight necessarily.
So I just wanted to open up in our last couple of minutes if any of our panelists had any closing remarks. And then we were going to turn to our visualizers for a couple of minutes to see what they've been doing. Well, I want to thank you all. I think there's a lot of information that we're processing and a lot of opportunity. I'm excited by wonder, and I'm excited by the idea that our closures and have openings, and that our time tomorrow, our students' time tomorrow doing participatory workshops is really also about understanding those openings and leading to actionable design, and understanding that scope. I think it gives us a somewhat permission to say we can't fix the economy or capitalism or certain issues that we feel passionately and importantly about, and that we cannot be hamstrung by that. We can't remain inert in the face of the momentous world issues about what we can do as a community. And I think that's where our reciprocity really lives, trying to find that word, right? That mutual engagement, and that we're all relational designers. So while we've been having this conversation, I'd like to call on Audrey and Osif, because throughout the day, they've been sketching and drawing, and it's a form of communication, meaning making, where they have been taking your talks, our participants' questions, and transforming them into visual. And if they're with us here, I see Audrey. I think they're going to share what they've done, just for a couple of minutes. Who would like to screen share?
I'll go ahead and screen share. Yeah.
Like being in class, right?
Sorry, give me a moment to figure out how I can show everything.
Mm-hmm. Osif and Audrey are senior illustration students here at ArtCenter. They are also participants in a minor called Design Matters, and that is the college's minor for social innovation. And you'll see that this program's website is part of that program. Over to you, Audrey.
Yeah, thank you. So for those who may be unfamiliar, we're here just to sort of take sketch notes, which is a form of visual note taking. And right now I'm sharing one of our earlier sketch notes, which was from Josh's session earlier in the symposium. And yeah, so what we're doing is taking away key points and sort of just arranging the information in a way that's a bit more visual in nature. You can see we have like a lot of highlights, doodles, just to sort of reinterpret what we've been hearing from everyone. So yeah, I'll see if I can try and reshare some other notes. Yeah, so our process is usually a bit rougher while we're in the live sessions, but then we'll go back and sort of watch the recordings and also use that to fill in whatever we might have missed. And yeah, we'll tighten it up and we'll be able to share all these sketch notes from today and tomorrow in the next week.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really a marvelous way of sharing our thinking process, thinking, making, drawing. So thank you, Audrey and Osef, and they'll be available with all the materials when we come to publish them online.
Yeah, that was really great to see. Thank you. And I really enjoyed this second half as well. I took a lot of notes and a lot of things to think about, and I'm excited to chat more with the students and faculty in the class. So as we wrap this up, as Maggie said, tomorrow is a day for the students to be in smaller sessions with some of the speakers, the project team, designers, archivists, to work with all of us a bit more, which we're all looking forward to. And for this, like we said, this is being recorded. We're going to share the link with everybody. There's resources on the Slack channel. There is a project website, which I'll put in the chat right now. And yeah.
I also wanted to extend a thank you again. We mentioned everybody when we started this session. So thank you all who made the program possible, our faculty, our students who have joined us. And I also wanted to extend a special thank you to Mara and Courtney, who have helped us include as many people as we can in this conversation. So thank you, Mara, Courtney.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to our AV team as well to help get this all set up. Then thank you all for attending.
Thank you all for attending, and look out for all of these materials online in the coming weeks. Thank you, everybody.